This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel.NumberFire.com, and this is episode 587 of the Late Round Podcast, the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I know some of you have already watched your trade deadlines pass, but it hasn't in a lot of leagues thanks to the extra week this year. Not only that, but these transactions can still be helpful even if you can't actually trade players. You can at least plan accordingly based on who's a buy and a sell. So keep that in mind as you listen today. Before getting into the transactions, though, I want to remind you guys to check out this week's Sunday Million contest over on FanDuel. The prize pool is a whopping $1.75 million, and first place takes home $300,000. All you have to do is head over to FanDuel today and click on the NFL Sunday Million contest. Draft your lineup of players, sit back, and enjoy Sunday NFL football. Go to FanDuel.com today to participate in the NFL Sunday Million. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. Add Alexander Mattison. Dalvin Cook's going to miss some time because he dislocated his shoulder on Sunday against the 49ers. That means that Alexander Mattison is going to be the starter for Minnesota once again. We have a 2-game sample this season of the Vikings offense without Dalvin Cook. In those games, Mattison saw 26 rush attempts and 25 rush attempts. He had a 79% running back rush share and a 93% running back rush share. And unlike previous seasons where we saw Alexander Mattison as the lead back, he's had good target shares without Dalvin Cook this year. He's had target shares of 21% and 23%. They've basically utilized Alexander Mattison exactly how they utilized Dalvin Cook when Dalvin Cook's been sidelined. So it's obvious, if Alexander Mattison is on your waiver wire, you need to add him this week. I usually don't talk about players who are rostered in about half of Yahoo leagues, but in this case, I think I had to. Because at the end of the day, after waivers run this week, Alexander Mattison should be rostered in 100% of leagues. Add Jamal Williams. So DeAndre Swift's injury kind of ruined Thanksgiving for some people this year. He left Detroit's game with a shoulder injury against Chicago. He finished the day with just 3.9 PPR points. Thankfully, it looks like that injury is just day to day and not like week to week. But you should still be adding Jamal Williams off the waiver wire this week. He's currently rostered in just 39% of Yahoo leagues, and he saw the bulk of the backfield work against Chicago once DeAndre Swift was sidelined. He had a 79% running back rush share and a 20% target share. If he has that type of backfield share in week 13, he'll be a worthy start. Buy DeAndre Swift. Okay, so it's a little bit weird that I just talked about adding Jamal Williams. Now I'm saying buy DeAndre Swift. But for teams looking forward to the playoffs and for teams that are willing to take on a risk because obviously he's hurt right now, I think he makes sense. We know that he has RB1 upside. He's been an RB1 in PPR formats this year. And whoever has DeAndre Swift, they might be a little bit down on him based on what happened on Thanksgiving. And for what it's worth, according to Pro Football Doc, he thinks this injury is not a long-term injury. So I think that if you're a playoff team, and specifically if you're a playoff team with a first-round bye, Swift is a really good target. In Week 16, Detroit gets Atlanta. That's a top 5 team in schedule-adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. The next week, it's Seattle. That's another good opponent. So he could have 2 monster weeks during the most important time of the fantasy football year. Add Chuba Hubbard and Amir Abdullah. Christian McCaffrey just can't catch a break. On Sunday, McCaffrey was seen in a walking boot after that game against Miami because he rolled his ankle, and then on Monday, he's out for the year. We won't see Christian McCaffrey on a football field again this season. I think it's obvious for people to say, oh, I gotta have Chuba Hubbard now. Earlier in the year when CMC was sidelined, Hubbard played 5 games as the team's top back. In those games, he averaged a running back rush share per game of 81.5%. He had a target share per game of 10.4%. But even with that volume, he never gave us a top 12 running back performance in PPR leagues. And that's part of the downside here. Christian McCaffrey was an obvious RB1 as long as he was healthy. Chuba Hubbard is a volume-based RB2. That's what he's been. And a big problem for Chuba Hubbard is that the Panthers have utilized Amir Abdullah in a pass-catching role over the last month or so. Since Week 8, which is a 5-game sample, Abdullah has hit a double-digit percentage target share 4 times. His target share per game average is 14% during this time. And as my colleague Jim Sonis pointed out, he's outsnapped Hubbard in 4 straight games thanks to that receiving role that he has. And then there's the fantasy playoffs. The Panthers have arguably the worst schedule for running backs during weeks 15, 16, and 17. They get the Bills, Buccaneers, and Saints. At the very least, Carolina is going to be underdogs against Buffalo and Tampa Bay. And any negative game script means that we might see more Amir Abdullah than Chuba Hubbard. It's understandable as to why Chuba Hubbard is going to be a popular ad this week. We've already seen him get a lot of work with Christian McCaffrey sidelined. But I think that you could argue very easily that right now is the time to actually sell Chuba Hubbard. Like, pick him up off the waiver wire and see what you can get for him. Because chances are the Panthers aren't going to give him a full bell cow workload with Amir Abdullah in the mix. And even if they feed him like they did earlier this year, he's got a real chance to post very average numbers in the fantasy playoffs because of these matchups. So to me, in PPR formats, yes, I would prioritize Chuba Hubbard over Amir Abdullah. But I think we're going to look back and see that Abdullah was the better value. Your league mates are going to spend a ton of cash to get Hubbard, but you can spend very little and get Abdullah. And keep in mind, the Panthers have a bye this week. That's another reason to not be very, very high on this backfield. I think overall, I'm just not really feeling this backfield all that much given the matchups, given how they're likely to split it, and given the fact that the offense just hasn't performed very well. Sell Myles Gaskin. So Myles Gaskin has been really good over the last month and a half. He scored at least 15 PPR points in 4 of his last 6 games. He's finished as an RB1, so a top 12 running back in 3 of his last 4. And that includes a 19.2 touchdown performance on Sunday against the Panthers. Now, during this stretch where Gaskin's seen some RB1 outings, he's also seen his rushing usage increase. From weeks 1 through 8, Gaskin's running back rush share per game was only 48.6%. His target share per game was about 13%. Over his last 4, though, that running back rush share number has jumped to 75.4%. The target share is still pretty good at 10%. So the peripherals are there. Why am I sitting here on this show saying to sell Myles Gaskin? Well, the Dolphins recently claimed Phillip Lindsay. And in his first game action with the team, which came on Sunday, he ran the ball 12 times and had a 36.4% running back rush share. Gaskin's running back rush share this past weekend was actually the lowest that he's seen since week 6. Now, maybe some of this was the result of this positive game script that Miami had. Lindsay did have 5 of his 12 attempts in the fourth quarter. But this could also be the start to a headache. Not only did Miami claim Lindsay last week, but they claimed Lindsay after Gaskin struggled on the ground. Even though Gaskin's been good in fantasy football, he hasn't been a very good running back. According to Number Fire's expected points model, he's at a well below average 28.8% success rate. That measures the percentage of positive expected points runs made by a running back. What's really helped Myles Gaskin recently is touchdowns. He scored twice in week 12, and he's now averaged a touchdown per game over the last month. And while he has a really, really good matchup against the Jets in week 15, he gets the Titans and Saints in week 16 and 17. Those are 2 of the better teams in football against running backs. There just seems to be a lot working against Myles Gaskin right now, despite his performance on Sunday. And I think because of that performance, you have a sell high opportunity. Add Taysom Hill. It sounds like Taysom Hill is going to finally be the QB1 for the Saints. Fantasy football managers now have to add him. He started 4 games last year, and in those 4 games, he averaged over 21 fantasy points per game while scoring no fewer than 17.5 points. He was QB 13 or better in weekly scoring in every single start. And as we know, it has to do with his legs. He averaged 52 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown per game during those starts. Maybe those rushing touchdowns regress a little bit, but like we've seen with Jalen Hurts, the rushing component is nothing to brush off. Taysom Hill could very easily be a QB1 now. Buy Saquon Barkley. This transaction absolutely needs context. If you're feeling pretty good about your playoff chances, there's no reason to take on a player like Saquon Barkley. Because the Giants' offense just isn't very good, and Barkley hasn't been close to special this season. His highest single game rushing total is just 57 yards. And not only that, but New York doesn't have a good fantasy playoff schedule. This transaction is for teams that need a spark. It's for teams that need a little bit more variance on their squad. Barkley was back to seeing his traditional workload in week 12. In week 11, which was his return from injury, he saw just 2/3 of New York's running back rushes, and he had a 16.7% target share. That target share was great, but the running back rush share was not so great, at least for Saquon Barkley. This past week against Philadelphia, that running back rush share number jumped by about 15 percentage points. The target share was over 17%. And he also saw his second highest snap share of the season at 86.7%. It's just really tough to find those peripheral numbers at the running back position. Volume drives fantasy football. And as a result, it makes sense for teams to try to buy Barkley because he's seeing that volume. But again, I can't stress this enough. If you're feeling pretty good, if your team's in a good spot, you don't need to make this transaction. This is all about pouncing on the opportunity to acquire after a down performance. Add Tevin Coleman. It made sense that Tevin Coleman saw the most work in the Jets' backfield in Week 12. In Week 11, we saw him out-touch Ty Johnson in that backfield after Michael Carter's injury. So with Carter on IR, Coleman was going to see at least some work in that backfield. And then the Jets didn't have a negative game script. That meant more Coleman and less Johnson, because Johnson's been utilized more as a pass catcher this year. Now, Coleman didn't score the most points at running back for New York this week because Austin Walter is a real person and he found the end zone. But Coleman did see 51.6% of the team's running back rushes, and he had a 13% target share. Both of those numbers were highs in that backfield. Now, obviously, it's tough to trust anyone on the Jets, and that's even truer when we're talking about Jets running backs. Michael Carter was usable because he was capturing a large portion of that backfield. Coleman's numbers weren't as high. So you got to temper expectations here. He should just be added this week because it's really tough to find any sort of relevancy at the running back position in fantasy football. Buy David Montgomery. So during the 3 weeks since David Montgomery's return from injury, he's played no fewer than 84% of Chicago's snaps in a single game. He's averaged a running back rush share per game of 83.6%, and his target share per game is 6%. He's also scored no more than 10.4 PPR points in any one of those games. There is some concern. Like, that receiving workload is not great. His highest target share in a single game since coming back from injury is just 8.1%. And it's not like the Bears have this high-powered offense. But according to Pro Football Focus, Montgomery's ranked in the top 10 in routes run at the running back position over the last 3 weeks. He's actually been the only Bears running back who's been targeted. They just haven't targeted their running backs a whole lot. And the Bears also have a really nice playoff schedule for David Montgomery. They get the Vikings, Seahawks, and Giants in weeks 15, 16, and 17. It's actually the second best schedule for running backs in the fantasy playoffs. That's according to my adjusted fantasy points allowed method, because each of those teams rank as top half matchups for running backs. So I would expect a better David Montgomery moving forward. Add Dontrell Hilliard. Adrian Peterson is no longer a Tennessee Titan, and Jeremy McNichols missed Week 12. That left the backfield to Dontrell Hilliard and Deontay Foreman. Hilliard outscored Foreman in PPR formats 18.3 to 10.2. And he was the one who was utilized more as a pass catcher. He had a 9.5% target share. Foreman's target share was 4.8%. But Foreman out-attempted Hilliard 19 to 12. So I would say that the split between these two backs, when you're factoring the type of touches they were getting, it was about 50-50. But Hilliard's rostered in fewer leagues than Foreman over on Yahoo. And he should be added this week. The Titans have gone with a run-heavy approach, running the ball more frequently than they've thrown it in 2 of their last 3 games. Some volume should go to their running backs in a given week. And if Jeremy McNichols continues to miss time, Hilliard should keep up a decent target share. Now, I will say, I think that Deontay Foreman, if he's out on your waiver wire, he's a better add this week than Dontrell Hilliard. Because in that game against New England, he had a similar snap share as Hilliard. But that game saw the Titans in a negative game script. And Hilliard's the pass catcher in that backfield. That script favored Hilliard, but even still, Foreman saw a lot of work. So in a better game flow situation, Deontay Foreman could be useful. But both guys should be added this week. Add Kendrick Bourne. So if you've listened to the Sleeper Show over the last couple of weeks, I've talked about Kendrick Bourne. And I talked about him last week, and he came through with a very, very big game. Across Bourne's first 7 games this season, he averaged a target share per game of 11%. And he hit a 15% target share in just 1 game. Over his last 5, that target share per game has risen to 18.6%. He hasn't fallen below a 15% target share in a single contest over his last 5 games. Naturally, his fantasy performances have gotten better. During his first 7 games, he averaged a little under 11 PPR points per game. Since then, it's been 13.7. And he has 2 23-plus point outings over his last 3. Now, these splits that I'm throwing at you guys, they're arbitrary. He hasn't actually been playing that much more. He's just been getting more work in the offense, and it's paying off in fantasy football. So if you need a little bit of wide receiver help, especially from a big play wide receiver, he does make some sense off the waiver wire. Sell Damian Harris. I've talked about Damian Harris so many freaking times on this show this year because he just keeps beating touchdown expectation. He's just the kind of running back that I do not like in fantasy football. He was easier to feel decent about earlier in the year when the running back rush share numbers were in that like 60 to 80% range, but that's fallen dramatically over the last couple of games with Ramondre Stevenson in the mix. In week 11, Harris saw his running back rush share at just 43.5%. That's the lowest of the season. This past week, it was 55%. That's still a lot lower than his 65% average from weeks 1 through 8. Let's just face it, guys. He's 100% touchdown dependent. He's just fortunately scored in 6 of his last 7 games. Even still, even with those touchdowns, he's given you just one RB1 performance during that time frame because he doesn't catch passes. They don't utilize him that way. With his peripherals pointing downward because of Stevenson, it's hard to feel good about Damian Harris from here on out. And considering he scored a touchdown this past week, maybe you can sell him. Add Rex Burkhead. So on Sunday, we saw the Texans' backfield for the first time this year without Phillip Lindsay, who I talked about earlier. And as you'd expect, it was a split backfield. Rex Burkhead had 12 attempts, David Johnson had 10, and they each had 3 targets. But if you want to add one of these guys off the waiver wire this week, I'm going to go with Rex Burkhead. Because if you look at their snap shares, Burkhead had a 61% snap share this past week. That was the highest snap share of any Houston running back this season. I don't think Rex Burkhead has a lot of upside. I don't think he's going to save your fantasy lineup, but he's good depth. Add Boston Scott. So with Jordan Howard sidelined in week 12, Boston Scott led the Eagles with a 62.5% running back rush share. He ran the ball 15 times for 64 yards. I wouldn't say that was planned, though. He was out-attempted by Miles Sanders 6-4 in the first half, and then Sanders hurt his ankle at the start of the second half. And that likely led to more work for Boston Scott. And you should be adding Boston Scott because of that this week. Because what if Miles Sanders misses time? What if Jordan Howard misses time? All of a sudden, Boston Scott would see a pretty big workload in that backfield. And then I'd expect Kenneth Gainwell to play a pass-catching role. So add Boston Scott because there could be volume this week, depending on how things shake out. Add the Minnesota Vikings defense. So if you go over to FanDuel Sportsbook, you'll see that the Vikings are 7-point favorites over the Lions this week. And Detroit's been the 7th friendliest offense for opposing defenses this year, according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. This is just a process move. It's a defense that's a favorite against a below average quarterback. So the Vikings make a lot of sense as a streamer this week. The 16th transaction this week that you can't get in my 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com is to add Sony Michel. When you look at the current fantasy landscape, one thing is obvious. Running backs are getting hurt, as they do each year. This is most definitely the time of year to handcuff. It's been the time of year to handcuff. Whether it's handcuffing one of your running backs or someone else's running back. You should be rostering backup running backs who have a chance to become usable pieces if the top running backs on their teams get hurt. Sony Michel is one of those players. He feels like the most obvious lower rostered handcuff that would become something if the starter goes down. And he's rostered in about 1/4 of Yahoo leagues right now. So you should add him. And while you're doing that, look at players like Ronald Jones. Make sure that Darrell Williams is still rostered. Make sure backup running backs and good offenses are rostered right now. It can really, really make a difference down the stretch. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly 10 Trend Show.